Welcome to Bench to Bedside, a weekly series of live conversations about recent advances in cancer, from the research bench to treatment at the patient's bedside. And now, your host and the director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center, Dr. Roy Jensen.
This year, about 57,000 Americans will learn they have pancreatic cancer. Most of these cases will be diagnosed at later stages when it is more difficult to treat. Because of this, the 5-year survival rate for pancreatic cancer is very low, less than 10%. But there's hope, and that's research. Scientists at the University of Kansas Cancer Center are committed to advancing our understanding of pancreatic cancer from all angles, from working with patient research advocates to identifying ways to detect it earlier and treat it more effectively. Good morning. I'm Dr. Roy Jensen, director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center. With me this morning is Dr. Michael Von Son, a basic scientist, Dr. Anup Kasi, a medical oncologist, and Kim Jones, a cancer survivor and member of our patient research advocacy program, Pivot. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to start off with Dr. Kasi. Could you explain to us why, among really all cancers, pancreatic cancer is such a deadly disease?
Yeah, no, that's a very timely question because recently pancreatic cancer-related deaths have surpassed breast cancer-related deaths in the U.S., and now this is the third leading cause of cancer-related deaths. And if we don't do anything to further improve our patient outcomes, then it could soon be the second leading and the first leading cause of cancer-related deaths. Now, the reason why this is deadly, the main reason is because it is hard to catch it early on in the development process or at an earlier stage. And a majority of the patients, I would say about 60 to 70% of the patients, we catch them when the cancer is already spread to another organ like the liver or the lung, when we cannot cure these cancers. And in about up to 20% of the cases, the cancer grows locally and it invades or encases the blood vessels, the major blood vessels that sit right behind the pancreas, and in which case we cannot cut them out. So that's one of the reasons. But also, the current standard treatment options that we have available for our patients, which is mainly chemotherapy, it has improved over time and the survival has improved, but it is not a home run. And the reasons being, the cancer develops resistance to it over time. Also, there's a lot of scar tissue and fibrosis around the tumor. And there are other cells in addition to the cancer cells, like the fat cells or immune cells, that all control the cancer. And so those are the reasons why the cancer is deadly and it's hard to treat cancer.
Mm-hmm. So what are the signs and symptoms of a patient with pancreatic cancer?
Yeah, some of these symptoms could be nonspecific, like fatigue, loss of weight, loss of appetite. That could be due to other reasons, but there are some symptoms that are more specific towards pancreatic cancer, such as jaundice, that is a yellow discoloration of the skin or the eyes, abdominal pain, especially if it's epigastric pain in the upper part of the abdomen and shooting to the back. And also change in the color of the stools and the urine, dark urine or pale colored stools. So those are some more specific symptoms. And new onset diabetes, diabetes that has been diagnosed over the last 6 months or in the last year or two. Those are red flags for pancreatic cancers.
So are there any factors that increase a person's risk for getting pancreatic cancer?
Yes, majority of these are environmental or lifestyle-related risk factors, obesity, high BMI, consumption of saturated fat, smoking, alcohol intake, and also diabetes. All of these increase the risk of pancreatic cancers. And I would say about 10 to 20% of pancreatic cancers could be hereditary syndromes or a genetic predisposition that could be passed through the family, such as BRCA1, BRCA2 genes. And so, any pancreatic cancer patient that walks in the door, I always send them to our genetic counselor to undergo genetic testing. And that is a recommendation by our guidelines, by ASCO and NCCN, to perform genetic testing or germline testing, because it not only impacts the patient's treatment in choosing the treatments, but also has implications on the family members, the siblings and the the children of the patient.
So now I want to turn to Kim Jones, one of our Pivot representatives. And Kim and I have known each other for a long time. Kim's a breast cancer survivor, and she's come on to talk about how that's impacted her life. But you also have a connection to pancreatic cancer. And could you tell us about that, Kim?
I have a connection to cancer from my grandparents. All of my grandparents had different forms of cancer. My mom's mother had cervical cancer. She passed away in 1992. I had a great grandmother that passed away from breast cancer on my mom's side in 1968, and my grandfather and on my dad's side had leukemia, and he passed away in 1987, a year after my grandmother on my dad's side, his wife, committed suicide while she was taking chemotherapy for her leukemia, and just could not weather the storm of the chemotherapy. And then I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2012, and I'm a survivor of that now for 8 years. And then my dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2016. And unfortunately, he lost his battle 2 years later, 2018.
So obviously you have way too much experience with this disease from multiple family members. Could you tell us about how all of this, led you to Pivot, and why you have been so involved in this organization, and what? Tell me a little bit about what Pivot actually does.
I had the opportunity to become introduced to Pivot in 2016, and Pivot is a wonderful program that KU, organization that KU formed, where they place patients and or co-survivors of cancer patients with researchers, so they can have a better understanding and of what the research is doing to save the patients involved. And so they get an opportunity to work with some patients who are actually still actively taking treatment, and then also to speak with people who have had treatment or been involved with people who have helped and supported people as they've gone through treatment, so they can so the researchers can get a better understanding of what it looks like while they're saving our lives and in the labs and doing all of their hard work to, eradicate this horrible disease and make our lives better.
That's great. If you're just joining us, we're here with Dr. Anoop Kasi, Dr. Michael Von Son, and Kim Jones, talking about how we address pancreatic cancer research across the entire cancer continuum. This is one of the pillars of being an NCI-designated cancer center. Remember to share the Bench to Bedside link with people you think might benefit from our discussion. So, Dr. Von Son, you and your research specifically focus on the role of adipose tissue, or fat, in the progression of pancreatic cancer. Could you tell us a little bit about your work, please?
Yeah, sure. The overarching goal of my lab is to really understand obesity as a risk factor for cancers. And as Dr. Kasi mentioned, pancreatic cancer is one of those. And so, as you know, the obesity rates are increasing worldwide. And what we really want to try and figure out is what are the components of obesity that are responsible for promoting pancreatic cancer development, and more importantly, pancreatic cancer progression. One of the ways in which we wanted to look at components of obesity was to really focus on the adipose tissue. and try and figure out some ways to uncover these factors that are responsible for obesity-driven pancreatic cancer progression. And so we chose the adipose tissue because it had been largely overlooked by when the time we started looking at it. And many people thought of this as like an indolent tissue, or a tissue that really wasn't doing anything except for storing the cheeseburgers and the barbecue that we had eaten the previous weekend, and really just filling up our bellies. But on the contrary, the research has really shown that the adipose tissue is an active tissue, and it has major roles in metabolic as well as hormonal regulation, which can directly affect the cancers. And so our research is really then focused on looking at a direct interaction between cancer cells and adipocytes, and that crosstalk or that communication between them. And so we've kind of taken a couple of approaches in order to look at this. And really the first one is actually looking at the adipose tissue itself. And so we're trying to figure out how the adipose tissue talks to the cancer cells. And we know that obesity is a risk factor because it causes a chronic inflammation of that adipose tissue. And when the adipose tissue becomes inflamed, it becomes reactive and starts secreting lots of different factors that enter the bloodstream. It can then go throughout the body and affect all the tissues as well as the cancer cells. And so we wanted to know what these factors were doing to the cancers. And so we initially did just a very simple experiment in which we took fat out of patients that were lean or fat out of patients that were obese. We put them in tissue culture and collected all those factors that were secreted from them, and then took those and put them on cancer cells. And what we found is exactly what we thought. The factors that came from the obese adipose tissue cause the cancer cells to proliferate faster, grow faster, and become more aggressive than the lean adipose tissue factors. And so this really told us that they were influencing the cancer cells. And so that was idea number one. Idea number two was really that maybe the cancer cells are also talking to the adipocytes. So as the cancer cells grow, they get more and more. Well, that takes energy. And so the cancer cells need a lot of energy in order to grow and become aggressive. And where do they get that energy from? And one great source of energy is the adipose tissue. Its whole purpose is to store tissue. Just like a bear during the winter, it needs that fat reserve in order to feed itself and all of its tissues over the winter. Well, we think the cancer cells kind of do the same thing, and that they may play an active role in pulling that energy out of the adipocytes and using it for their own benefit. And so we did some simple experiments of this too by labeling up all the energy stores in the fat cells and putting those fat cells in a dish and then adding cancer cells. And what we found is that they do indeed pull lipids out of the adipocytes and use them, take them up, use them and digest them for energy, and it helps them to grow faster. And so what we found from these is now we're finding targets, trying to identify these factors in this communication between the cancer cells and the adipocytes that we can now target with therapeutic drugs to try and intervene. And so that's where we're at.
So Dr. Von Sohn, you run a basic science laboratory focused on pancreatic cancer. How does it work in an NCI-designated cancer center in terms of connecting what's going on in your laboratory with the clinic, and specifically how does that lead to potential new therapeutic approaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we kind of do a multitude of things. One, of course, our basic research efforts are trying to identify new targets, right? And we hope that those new targets then we can advance onto the clinic. But also, what we try and do is take things that we learned from the clinic and then investigate why they did or did not work. So, if you add a drug or you give a drug to a patient, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I think a classical example of this I could give you would be maybe drug penetrance, or how well a drug can get into a tumor. And this goes along with the idea that gemcitabine is kind of the major drug that has been used for a long time in the clinic to treat pancreatic cancer patients, except for the fact that it has never been really very effective. And then we take it in the lab and we add gemcitabine to cancer cells in the lab and they die very fast. So we know that gemcitabine kills the cancer cells, but when you give it to the patient, it doesn't. So we wanted to know why. And I think Dr. Tufeson's lab really kind of demonstrated through their basic research efforts a really good demonstration of this is that what they found, but through basic research, is that the pancreatic cancers are very fibrotic and very hard. Also, what that causes is it causes a constriction of the blood vessels. And when those blood vessels get constricted, then there's no blood flow into the tumor. When there's no blood flow into the tumor, then of course the chemotherapeutics can't get into the tumor. And so if the chemotherapeutics can't get in there, they can't do what they're supposed to do. And so I think this is an example of, where they have a drug in the clinic that's not being very effective, but why? And this, because it's not getting into the tumor. So now this has really advanced a lot of cancer treatments because we're trying to find ways in order to open up the tumor, open up those blood vessels so that the delivery can be better. And so now maybe some of these drugs that didn't work can actually be more effective. And so I think that's kind of one of the ways in which we can begin to address some of these problems and help advance cancer treatments in the clinic.
Thanks. So, Dr. Kasi, your research in pancreatic cancer sort of focuses on the other end of the spectrum of this process, and that is clinical research and trials that focus on trying to improve therapeutic outcomes. Could you tell us a little bit about how that works? And specifically, I know that you have an investigator-initiated trial focused on pancreatic cancer.
Sure. So yes, I focus in clinical research in the form of clinical trials, and I also collaborate with basic scientists like Dr. Van Son in terms of translational research. And I also have the honor of serving on the National Pancreatic Cancer Task Force by the NCI, National Cancer Institute. So really to brainstorm and better understand how pancreatic cancer behaves, its biology, and how to target it, and identify new drugs or new treatment options. So here at KU, the investigator-initiated clinical trial that we have up and running focuses on pancreatic cancers that harbor a specific biomarker. So this is a biomarker-driven trial where we focus on cancers and test them and see if they harbor a defect in what we call as the DNA repair mechanism. And if they have that defect, then we treat them with a targeted pill form of treatment called PARP inhibitor and give them a break from chemotherapy. So hopefully patients benefit in terms of improved outcomes and survival, as well as a quality of life now that they're off chemotherapy. So that's the approach we're taking for our patients. And like what Dr. Van Son already mentioned, looking at other targets, targeting other cells in addition to just the pancreatic cancer. Dr. Van Son and I have discussed some concepts like that, which we hopefully would get into the pipeline here and focus on basically personalizing a treatment for your pancreatic cancers.
So now I want to kind of talk big picture and kind of the future of pancreatic cancer research. And I want to hear from each of you. What are you most excited about, moving forward when it comes to the future of pancreatic research and treatment? And Kim, I'm gonna start with you.
Well, yes. What most excites me about research and what we have going on with KU and Pivot is the opportunity to share the information that I've learned while working with all of the members of Pivot and through the hospital, and to invite and encourage people that have gone through a cancer diagnosis or treatment to participate in research studies. Many African American people have chosen not to be involved in research because of our history with exposure to negative experiments and things like that. But I also know that because of the research that we have, people are living longer and getting better results from their treatment because of the research that's being done in cancer. So I just definitely would encourage people to stay in tune there.
Thanks, Kim. Dr. Von Son, where do you see the field going?
Well, I mean, I think I agree with Dr. Kasi. What Kasi said is that I'm excited about personalized therapeutics. Really trying to understand what factors are affecting each person. And my research deals with obesity, so trying to help those patients. They have a factor that maybe other pancreatic cancer patients don't have, and I think that's kind of what we're finding is that each person's tumor is a little bit different, and we really need to personalize the treatment options for them. So finding some of these targeted therapeutics is great. But I think the other really thing I'm excited about is just how far we've come in the last 5 years with pancreatic cancer. Like I said before, we always used gemcitabine, and we didn't really have another option. And that was because nobody was really trying to figure out why. But the number of researchers that are dedicated to pancreatic cancer research in the last 5 years has just exploded tremendously. And I think this is an important aspect for really trying to find an effective therapeutic, because one lab can't do it all. I mean, our lab does adipose tissue, but and the effects of obesity, but there's so many other factors. And to me, this is really like a numbers game that we're really starting to come to this critical mass where we might start really trying to find things that are effective. And that's what makes me excited, is that we will find, hopefully now an effective therapeutic and relatively soon.
Dr. Kasi.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of them, and it's an exciting time to be an oncologist in this era of precision medicine, genomic medicine, or personalized medicine. And, there's a lot of effort, a lot of funding going towards understanding the pancreatic cancer biology and new targets, including Dr. Van Son and other researchers here. And we have to move that from the bench to the bedside and test that in our patients. And hopefully they benefit from it. And our patient advocates like Kim and others play a big role in encouraging patients to participate in these novel clinical trials that not only focus on treating the cancer cell alone, but also other cells that control the cancer. So I think that's where the field is heading. And I think it is a matter of time. And we will have treatments that will improve outcomes for our patients. I mean, in fact, we had the POLO trial where a targeted treatment was approved not too long ago by the FDA for pancreatic cancers that have BRCA1 and 2 mutations. So I'm sure in the near future we'll have more advances in treatment for pancreatic cancer.
Okay. So we're approaching the end of today's episode. And Kim, I want to hear from you in terms of what advice you would have for a patient who is newly diagnosed with pancreatic cancer.
Yes, definitely ask your oncologist about clinical trials, and if there are any that they may be aware of that you qualify for, and research clinical trials on your own. Look for you a support group, so you have some people you can connect to that are familiar with the things that you will be facing on this journey, and to also connect yourself to a pancreatic cancer specialist.
Sounds like very good advice. So, Kim, I want to thank you, and of course, Dr. Von Son and Dr. Kasi, thank you also for being part of this week's episode of Bench to Bedside. To learn more about pancreatic cancer, visit kucancercenter.org/pancreatic cancer. That's it for today. Join us next week at 10 a.m. for Bench to Bedside. Thanks for watching.